I'm Simon Szreter, Professor in this University of History and Public Policy and Managing Editor of the website History and Policy. As we've heard in various ways from previous speakers, history is really a critical, a reflexive dialogue between past and present, and our first speaker gave us such a dialogue in relation to the university and politicians' understandings of the university and our own understandings of it. I think that what I'm talking about is what I'm going to focus on is economic, social and cultural history, because that's what I have spent most of my life here in Cambridge teaching and researching and learning. And it's clear to us that history is a dialogue which is not being engaged in by policy makers and politicians in a sufficiently active way. One of the conclusions that we drew from that in our area was to found in 2002 something called the History and Policy website, which now exists with an external relations office, and we have something like 250 professional historians in the network who are available to write policy papers of 4,000 words, summarising their recent research and trying to present it in a way that might catch the eye of policymakers, i.e. bullet points and so on. No footnotes allowed. We have events. We have 110 of these policy papers ranging from, for instance, issues in foreign policy, Iran and Iraq, and recently a piece on the Lotus Revolution in Egypt, to, of course, domestic policies like the health policy, a recent one last month on a Conservative government, coalition government plans for health, putting them in the context of the NHS over the last 50 years. So a great range of policies. We have now over 100 press articles and broadcast interviews that have been created over the last 4 or 5 years since we've been funded philanthropically, and we have about 1,500 subscribers. So it's a platform attempting to get the fruits of academic research out there into the public discourse and trying to get it in front of policy makers. And we have an external relations officer to organise events, because of course just publishing these things is a great start, but actually you need to phone up, you need to bully and cajole, and you need to arrange events. And we've been quite successful in a brief way, in a starting way, in getting those things going. But undoubtedly, I think we need more activity of this kind in the arts and humanities, and I would encourage people to take a look at the History and Policy website and think about what, in their own disciplinary field, they might perhaps be able to do in emulating this kind of activity. It's not easy, and we're philanthropically funded, and we spend a good deal of our time chasing money, but it does work. Now, what I'm going to spend the second part of my brief talk giving you a flavour of is, in this field that I work in, economic, social, cultural history, a couple of examples perhaps of the ways in which the dialogue with the past, I think, can be quite unequivocally said to have really fundamentally transformed how we and even policymakers, I notice some of what I'm going to say is actually reflected even in David Willett's new book, The Pinch. He's actually got some of this. He's clearly done his homework, and some of what I'm about to say has even got now to that level. It's work. The first example I'll give is work that's evolved over the last 30 years, which much of it done here in Cambridge by the Cambridge Group for the History of Population, which has actually really completely changed our understanding of that great event, the Industrial Revolution, the origins of modernity and its relationship between economic growth and social and political institutions. Now, about the time that the sorts of models of economic growth and decline that our first speaker was talking about, that the Institute of Economic Affairs was infused with about the 60s and 70s, they would have been if they were up to date with their understanding of economic history, they would have been working off a model of the Industrial Revolution, which stressed what one could call a Big Bang, an explosive start between 1780 and 1840, all to do with inventions, entrepreneurs, capital accumulation, factory and railways. Suddenly, out of nowhere, this mushroom cloud erupted in the north of England, and the British economy flew off into self-sustaining growth in Rostow, the American historian's famous metaphor. And that was the kind of understanding of how economic growth happens, which dominated our literature and our economic assessments and development work, that capital accumulation was crucial and you must devote enormous efforts to that. And certainly leaders from Stalin through to Nyeri and in the West as well were obsessed with this kind of view. During the last 30 years, we have come to realize that this is completely wrong. Important, painstaking new research conducted over 30 years, crunching away with parish registers. In this country, we are fortunate we've got hundreds and hundreds of parish registers that survive, so that we have a much better understanding of the population dynamics of this country between 1540 and 1870 than any other country in the world at the moment, although other countries are now emulating this. And we now understand that an awful lot of what we thought was the sequence back in the 50s and 60s and 70s is completely the other way around. We have, instead of a Big Bang, we have a very long drawn-out process. Instead of nuclear families being the consequence of economic growth and urbanisation, they were there before in British society. That's, as I said, David Willetts has clearly understood that in his new work. Most importantly, something that was viewed as the great luxury that you get at the end of the process of economic growth, the welfare state, the thing that the West finally gifts itself in the 1940s and 50s, we now realise that the welfare state was there for 200 years before the Industrial Revolution. The poor law operating in every parish, keeping the English population uniquely free from famine. The only population in the world at that time that did not suffer famine because of this welfare state. And I can see that I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to give you my second example, but that's a good enough one for you to be thinking about, that development people now are working on ideas of social protection for the poor in Africa because they've begun to realise that actually these institutions are not the product of economic growth, they could well be the sources of it. Thank you very much.